So hello, and thank you for joining us today at our FIT Authors Talks. FIT Authors Talks is part of the Love Your Library event series and is an initiative of the FIT Library that brings authors from our community to speak about their work. From photography to fashion illustration, fiction writing to art, these talks encompass a multitude of projects and themes and celebrate creativity. Today, our FIT author is Professor Justine De Young, who is chair of the History of Art department, where she's been teaching since 2015. The Art of Parisian Chic, Modern Women and Modern Artists in Impressionist Paris was published in summer of 2025. Using artworks by Berthe Morisot, Édouard Manet, Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and others, The Art of Parisian Chic explores how women and artists in Impressionist Paris crafted their public images to exploit or resist stereotypes. We are excited for this talk tonight, and thank you for joining us, Justine, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Jenny and Greta, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first authors talk as part of the FIT authors series, so hopefully I'll be able to come back with my next book. But I'm really thrilled to be able to present this research, which I have to say is the product of more than 15 years. And so it's been a long time coming, but just to give you an idea of how I came to this topic, I will say that, my field of training is in art history, but I focused on a fashion history topic, namely that in this period, the Impressionist period, we see this really deep interest in modern life, right? In the painting of modern women and modern men and in life in the modern city. And you see lots of fashion and fashionable dress in those paintings. And so oftentimes when you're reading art historical writing about the art of this period, an author will say, oh, and she is very fashionably dressed. But unlike almost every other claim that you see art historians making, I was very frustrated as a graduate student because I found that there was no evidence given. Like they never were like, because as you can see in this fashion plate, you can see the same dress. They never gave any proof. It just was declared fashionable. And so I started to look into a lot of those claims. And what I discovered was, in fact, oftentimes the clothing wasn't fashionable. In fact, the whole reaction to the painting was governed by the fact that the person was in fact not fashionably dressed, or something about the way they were dressed told the contemporary viewer something about who that person was or who they thought that person was. And often it was pretty surprising. And so I set out to sort of investigate that and really think about how fashion influenced how women were seen, how they presented themselves in paintings, and also in photography. So I'll go ahead to the next slide. So you can see one of the key things that transformed Paris in this period is both the invention of photography, but then also the invention of relatively cheap photography that could be produced and distributed to your friends on these little small cards. They were called carte de visites. They're about 4 inches by 2.5 inches. And they were relatively cheap compared to, say, the daguerreotypes or the glass plate photographs that came before them. And it enabled people for the first time to access portraiture that, before this period, getting your portrait painted cost, hundreds, if not thousands of francs, which was out of the reach of all but the elite. But now photography was cheap and readily available, and so anyone could get their portrait taken. And of course, you could go pose, as you see here in these examples, in the studio of the photographer. You could wear your own clothes, as I believe actually both of these women are doing. But the photographer also would have clothes you could put on. So you also could make yourself look more fashionable and or more wealthy than you were in real life. And so there was a real mania for getting your picture taken and distributing it to your friends. And so when you start to look into the popular culture of the period, you really do see the surge of photography. And the caricature on the right, for example, is a good illustration of this woman looks perfectly fashionable and like, you know, respectable to us today. But if you actually read the caption, it's kind of a strange interaction. So she's admiring her little photograph, right? And how many the photographer asks her, how many do you want? And she's like, and he's like, maybe a dozen. But then she says, oh, I'm going to give them to all my friends. And his response is, well, then obviously a dozen isn't going to suffice, which, you know, seems a little bit bold. But of course, the implication is that she's so beautiful that she, of course, must have more friends than that. And that's confirmed if you go up and look at the top of the caricature. You can see it says, ces petites dames. And if you look into the sort of slang of the period, petite dame, it means little lady, was in contrast to grande dame, which were, you know, society women. And it was sort of a code for women of the demi-monde. So courtesans who might have many good friends, right? And so it becomes this sort of inside joke that you have to sort of understand who this woman is in order to understand. And that's true also of paintings in the period. So we have this moment when women and men are accessing portraiture for the first time, but they're also being able to dress more fashionably than ever before, thanks to a similar process, what gets called the democratization of fashion, which in this period meant that people of all classes were able to dress fashionably as never before. And this was thanks to things like mechanical looms, which led to the lowering of fabric prices, you know, all the sort of fruits of the Industrial Revolution. We also see changes in retailing. So from the sort of guild stores where only one type of good, like you would go to the ribbon store, you would go to the fabric store, you would go to the glove store. We see this sort of consolidation of all of that into what we know now today as department stores. And so department stores relied on volume. And so they really did lower prices dramatically, making sort of affordable luxury available to both the elites, but also the masses. And Paris was undergoing a surge in population, as you can probably guess from these illustrations. In the Bon Marché department store, they would have as many as 70,000 customers a day on sales days. So you really can sort of imagine the crush of people that we see here populating the store in real life. And on the left, in the Barraud painting, we see the store in front of Printemps, which is another of these grand department stores that in this case, it just burned down. So that's why we see the scaffolding. It was getting built back bigger and better. But you can see that the city is full of people, and particularly some rather eye-catching women, right? The population of Paris in this period really surged. So we have a population of about 2 million people versus at the beginning of the century, only about 500,000 people. And so it became an open question of who was it on the street. You didn't know. The city became anonymous in the way that it is now, right? You don't typically run into people that you know or recognize. And this democratization of fashion was also facilitated by the invention of things and the popular distribution of things like dress patterns. So fashion magazines started to produce dress patterns like you see here. I think we even have some of these in special collections that you could subscribe to that would enable you to replicate all the latest trends, either by taking this to your dressmaker or by using it yourself at home. And even couturiers like Charles Frederick Worth released some of their designs as dress patterns. And so you end up in a situation where, as you can see in the photograph at left, it's a photograph of dressmakers, but they're dressed just as finely as the clients that they would be dressing. So we see that these women have the skill and the fashion savvy to be able to sort of dress above their station in the opinions of the period. So it really became a moment when fashion became accessible to all women and all men. But I talk about women in the book. we're seeing also an explosion of the fashion press. So circulation numbers more than triple. We have the largest magazines start to circulate to hundreds of thousands of readers, and international sales of the magazines and also of couture soar in this period. So for example, the Moniteur de la Mode, which is one of the leading magazines at the time, had 8 foreign editions, including a bilingual French-English edition and a Franco-American edition. And Le Mode Illustré, which you see here, which was known for the beauty of its illustrations alongside Le Moniteur de la Mode, had subscribers on 6 continents, from as far away as China, Australia, the Marquesas. And they also produce fashion magazines at different price points. So I often show you the sort of fanciest of the journals because they're the most refined illustrations, like the Moniteur des Dames et Demoiselles on the right. But you can see at different price points and at different sizes, they would sell magazines that would be more popularly accessible. This one is still hand-colored, so it would have been pricier, but they also would produce uncolored versions where you could just buy the black and white prints. So the image on the left from the Mode Miniature is about 4 by 6 inches, which is about half the size of the image on the right. In New York, just because I wanted to connect it to here, a lot of women would subscribe to the French magazines, or maybe the Franco-English version, but they also could get French fashion news from American publications like Harper's Bazaar. I think this is a fun instance of where Harper's Bazaar is basically plagiarizing. They didn't have a license in this case to reproduce the image, and they do it a little bit clunkily a month later. So they sort of got the French plate and then they copied it over. You see the same thing happening here where one French magazine is publishing the plate on the left, and then Peterson's is tracing the dresses, and that's why they end up reversed on the plate, and they've inserted it into an entirely new context with another plagiarized dress. So that Peterson's was very much known for that. There were officially licensed uses as well, just not in these 2 cases. And so because of this, the sort of French, the chic Parisienne became a fashionable ideal, not only in Paris, but worldwide. We see a lot of interest in the fashionability and sophistication and chic of French women. And I'm illustrating that here with a painting that was widely celebrated in the 1860s for its embodiment of this idea of chic and of the ideal Parisienne, that she's confident, she's sophisticated, she's impeccably dressed. She's not just chasing the latest styles, but she's flattering herself. She of course reflects the body ideals of the time, which had a slender waist and an ample bust, but she has good taste. But she's not too matchy in the sense that in the fashion plate that you can see, the woman has both a pink flower at her breast and a pink flower in her hat, or in her hairpiece. But in the painting, she has taken this sort of yellow tea rose and used that in her hat, and at her breast she has that sort of pop of red. So it is that sort of special choice, that sort of customization, that actually even gets called out by art critics. Like we have an art critic talking about how that shows her sophistication and her individuality and her chic. So you see that their art critics, like everyone at the time, were incredibly attuned to fashion, and were reading these paintings extremely closely. The painting also has that sort of hint of sexy flirtatiousness, just a hint, right? In the sense that, she's pulling off her glove and she's already pulled off one, which has now fallen at her feet. And you see we're sort of gallantly invited to sort of pick it up and give it to her. So it tells us this little story. Her gaze, is very much engaging our own. And so this sort of image really did shape the sort of worldwide perception of French women's chic that is still with us today. Women who didn't fulfill the body ideals or beauty ideals of the period were not called Parisians. In fact, reading salon criticism, critics can be incredibly harsh when they are encountered by women who they think are not, in their opinion, sufficiently attractive. So this painting was painted a year later, also by Carolus Durand, and doubtless our heiress here, her name is Madame Richard. She was the heiress of the Gagne Petit, which was a department store fortune. She had a dowry of 2 million francs. This is when the average salary for a female French fashion worker was 540 francs a year, so 2 million is a considerable sum. Her marriage contract to a member of the Second Empire government was signed by Emperor Napoleon III, by Empress Eugenie, and the Crown Prince. So she was very highly placed. She was very well dressed. She obviously had the money for it, and has a beautiful conservatory, right? And doubtless she hoped to be recognized for her beauty and chic, which she was often praised for in society columns. But in this case, art critics were vicious. They called her a shop girl dressed like a lady. And one of the nicer things that I'll quote called her a good, simple lady of the middle class in vigorous health, is visibly satisfied with being rich, dressing well, and having a greenhouse full of flowers. But many critics called her massive, corpulent, vulgar, Rubenesque, and called her not a Parisienne, but sort of the type of the rich bourgeois lady. And you can see the character on the right, which covers her face and poses her alongside another portrait of a larger woman, is actually an ad for a period weight loss cure. So women were being judged extremely harshly. So how did we sort of get here? I mentioned just now Emperor Napoleon III and Eugenie. You can see them here. Napoleon III is the nephew of the first more famous Napoleon. He'd seized power in a coup in 1851. He went on to found France's Second Empire. And he had transformed Paris, right? So he really created the Paris that we know today. He built a flashy new opera house, the Palais Garnier, which you see in the painting on the left, with a lovely black-clad Parisienne in front of it. He created the broad new boulevards that had streetlights, trees, benches, urinals, all the modern conveniences, and also mandated that buildings along these boulevards follow the same general aesthetic. So we get thousands of similar 6-storied buildings with elegant iron balconies across the city, really sort of the image of Paris that you have today. He also transformed all of the public parks, all of the royal parks into public parks. And so life was lived in public as never before. I like to say that all of Paris became a show, right? Going riding in the Bois de Boulogne in the morning, walking along the boulevards, shopping, listening to concerts in the Tuileries. There were all these opportunities to see and be seen, and that became central to public life. And also the fashion industry was heavily promoted by Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie. We see Eugenie here on the right in the white dress with the purple bow. And she really was a strong supporter of French fashion, so much so that she even posed for a fashion plate. So on the left, you see a fashion plate of the Empress, which is highly unusual. Most fashion plates are not attached to any specific individual. But as you can see, it says Impératrice at the bottom. So she's here promoting her tailor, a French tailor, because she's trying to make sure that not only does France control women's wear in general, but also that she's trying to promote the French creation of riding habits, which at this point were dominated by London. London tailors were said to be the best at producing riding habits, but she, only 3 months after marrying Napoleon III, is appearing in this ad to sort of say that French tailors are just as good, that you should embrace French tailoring when you're riding. And she and Napoleon would require new dresses be worn at court, of course, made out of French silks. And so there really was this concerted effort to promote the luxury trades in France. Okay, so all of this is sort of adding up to a new sort of interest in these sort of stereotypes that that were mentioned at the very start. So imagine, you're navigating this new city. There's more people on the streets than ever before. You don't know who they are. And so, like even we do today, you look at someone and you make assumptions about who they were or who they are based on what they're wearing, how they're behaving. And the 19th century was no different. So we see a huge surge in what are called types, but essentially stereotypes about how a certain type of woman would dress and behave, and how a certain type of man would dress and behave. And this is across all the classes. That I talk about the 5 most fashionable types in my book for women at the time, and the ones that were the hardest to identify, because I think they're the most interesting, but they're also some of the ones that were most talked about and most often depicted. But this painting is a good illustration of the interest in types. So it's called The Two Sisters. It's by actually a Swiss artist, Charles Giron, and it's huge. It's 21 feet wide and 14 feet tall. And it has more than 20 different types. So when you read reviews of this painting, they identify over 20 different types that they can see in the picture. And I'll point out a few of them. If you want to learn about more, you could read the book. But the first I'll point out is, of course, the Parisienne in the front. She's in her black dress. She's got that very trim waist. She seems very chic. She's buying flowers. She's out walking. But if we turn our attention to the sort of the title drama between the two sisters, it's between a working class woman in the blue and white striped dress with the black apron. She's got the 2 kids on either side. You could say she's actually being chaperoned by her husband, who somewhat unlikely has both a baby and sort of like a pickaxe on his shoulder. So we know she's like a good mother, right? And she's got a husband who's very involved in his child rearing. By contrast, what she's doing is she's, pointing and presumably calling out at the women in the carriage, who we know from the reactions to the painting, but also from a lot of the cues that Giron uses, that she was a cocotte, and this more commonly known as a courtesan, I guess, today. And we know that for several reasons. She's in this very luxurious carriage and in a very showy dress, right? She's wearing light colors when during the day women often wear dark colors. She's all by herself, right? She's trying to attract attention, and she's got her tiny little dog, who's adorable. But little dogs were also associated with courtesans. I'll just point out a few others before we move on, but you can see a very shapely Amazon, which is a woman on horseback in the back. It's one of the types I talk about in the book, and we'll talk about more in a second. And we have a bourgeois mother and daughter, and then the flower seller, the bouquetière, in the foreground. And they all are basically sort of classic presentations of these different types. And so the painting was a huge success for that reason. So I just love this quote because it's written by a etiquette author, but it emphasizes that the choices women made and how they dressed and what they wore and how they wore it really mattered, but also who they had paint them, who they had photographed them, all of that was being judged and being scrutinized. And the quote here, I'll just read it along, but by the mere inspection of a woman's exterior appearance, another woman, if she has intelligence and the habit, will know what class she belongs to, what was her education, and what society she has seen. She will even discern her tastes, her character, if she takes the trouble to observe. Often her manner of arranging her shawl, of putting on her hat, of fastening her gloves reveals an entire existence. So they're very confident that they're right. But you have to imagine this would be a lot to grapple with. And so it's also largely lost to us today. Like, we don't have period eyes, but I aim to do in the book is really give you the ability to sort of see the women and see the way they were painted, and sort of recognize them as someone in the period would, because it's often quite different than what we expect. So with the time I have left, I'm going to go over the 5 different types briefly in the book that I talk about, and then I look forward to your questions. We're going to kick things off actually with the courtesan, with the cocotte, which is a figure I'm going to be associating with the painting of the lady in her underwear that we see in the middle center. That's a painting called Nana. The painting on the right is the representative image that I chose for the young, sexy widow. Yeah, it's hard to believe she's in mourning, but she is. Then we have, at the bottom, we have the Amazon, the equestrienne. And then on the right, we have the shop girl. And then, of course, our Parisienne, who we saw earlier. So the cocotte, the chapter is called the cocotte, the extravagant mistress. Like I said, the term we would use today is probably courtesan. But elite men in the Second Empire loved to flaunt their wealth by supporting not only their wives, but also their sort of extravagant mistresses who had much larger budgets even for clothes, for jewels, for high living. They became celebrity elite women and were known for extravagant spending. Conspicuous consumption was very central to the cocotte's identity, and they were dressed by the most fashionable couturiers. Charles Frederick Worth was famously willing to dress anyone who could pay. So here you have one of the most famous cocottes in the period, Cora Pearl. She was actually British. She was famously the mistress of Napoleon III's half-brother, Charles, the Duc de Morny. And she was known for her skill at riding. So you see her here in a double equestrian portrait, because I love that in this period you could also go and get your portrait taken on a horse, either your own horse, or you could rent a horse to get your painting or your photograph taken. These are definitely her own horses, but horseback riding had surged in popularity with Empress Eugenie's promotion of it, but also the British were very much known for their riding skill, so that she would go riding in the morning with her various lovers, like you can see here. Cocottes were very chic and obviously knew how to make an impact. I found this picture at the Met's, in the Met's photography department in an album of Distéry photographs. And it just, she just leapt to life when I saw her on the page. She really knew how to captivate. And you can see she's wearing extremely lavish pearls and a rather daring dress. But the scale of expenditure is huge here. So in 5 years, she spent just on horses. She bought more than 60 horses, spending in the space of only 3 years, 90,000 francs. With only a single horse dealer. So she's really incredibly wealthy. And that's the thing. I say the cocottes are at a different level. We often think of like mistresses or courtesans as sex work, or we could just consider them to be prostitutes. But in this period, they really were cultural celebrities and fashion leaders. And so, even today, we don't really consider mistresses to be sex workers. So I think I'm trying to redeem the reputation of the cocotte a little bit. You may be wondering what cocotte means, and I realized I should explain that. It actually means hen, which may sound surprising. Like, why are we calling these women hens? But we actually have the same expression in English for someone who is not the principal partner. We might call her the side chick. So in this case, she actually is the side chick. So that's where that slang comes from. There's also lots of other slang terms. A cocotte that you don't really like, you can call a pieuvre, which is like an octopus. Not a very flattering term. So that brings me to this painting, which was one of the most fun I had sort of researching a painting and being surprised, because this is a painting by Claude Monet. So it's his painting of his then girlfriend, Camille. And she's wearing this really luxe gown that we know actually he rented, because you could rent clothing in this period, because they weren't wealthy. But she's dressed in very expensive silks. And you can see it was posed by his girlfriend, and later they married. And so art historians have often just seen this as a portrait of his girlfriend and future wife, Camille. And so it's seen as been like a very charming portrait. But at the time, every critic thinks this painting is of a cocotte. And so figuring out why was a lot of fun. And it uncovered a lot of really interesting pop culture of the period. For example, you see that she's not wearing a crinoline. And in fact, there's jokes about that in the caricature left. And you might think, well, that's very strange. And indeed it is. But it's actually very much in keeping with a contemporary debate about the crinolines. That crinolines were being blamed for driving women to prostitute themselves in order to make enough money to be able to wear the crinolines. They were being blamed for sort of the moral downfall of society. There were even reports in the French Senate blaming the extravagant luxury of women for the corruption of morals. And so there was a call to give up the crinoline. We see that Empress Eugenie actually embraces this call. And so for a very brief period in 1865-66, we see crinolines disappear at court. Monet actually revises the skirt to make it slenderer, to make it obvious that she doesn't have a crinoline on, which really puts her in with the elite, even though at the time, like bourgeois women were still wearing, and other women were still wearing crinolines. But it also ties into a more complex story, which I thought was really interesting, about a play called The Famille Benoîton. And that play was also about the unbridled luxury of women. In the play, the main character, whose name is Camille, which I would point out is also the name of this painting, is constantly being mistaken for being a cocotte, even though she's not. It launched 1,000 fashion trends, including, if you notice, the black beads hanging down along her bonnet strings. That's a jet chain, and that was called a chaîne Benoîton. So it was a very deliberate thing to introduce into the painting, because it really connected the painting to that play, and also to the character of Camille, who was played by one of the most famous cocottes of the period, Léonardie Leblanc. Also, Camille didn't have beauty marks. Monet gave her beauty marks, and also added a hint of blush to her cheeks. Visible makeup was very much also associated with courtesans. So that was a fun one to sort of unpack, because it had been such a tame painting, but at the time it was seen as very racy. Of course, at the time, they did see this one as racy. This is Manet's Nana, where, you can see the sort of flirtatiousness and the confidence of Nana here at center. And her rather bored gentleman. We know she's a mistress and not a wife, because he's kept his hat on, which you didn't do in the presence of ladies. You also generally didn't watch your wife get dressed. But she is in her high heels. She's powdering her face, which is completely fine. Women of all classes powdered, but she also seems to be applying lipstick, which of course was not acceptable in this period. Here's another great caricature on the left of Ces Petites Dames, again, those little ladies, right? So we know right away this is about cocottes. But this one's hilarious to me, because we have these two ladies, and they're waiting for a gentleman back there who seems to be arguing with their coachman. And they're sort of complaining about how long it's taking. Like he's never going to finish, debating how much he needs to pay the coachman. And therefore, one of the women declares, well, we should just leave him, because if he's going to take 5 minutes to fight with the coachman over their fare, he's never going to pay the 9,245 francs that I owe to my couturier. So, a rather mercenary decision-making process. But it does, of course, immediately tell you what kind of women these are. Also, Renoir, we associate him with more wholesome images, but this image was definitely constructed to be of a cocotte. And I guess if I quizzed you, maybe you could tell me. But this sort of extravagant luxury of it all, the very visible makeup, very much a sign that she is part of the demi-monde, and also her very inattentive date, right? He seems to be on the lookout for a new partner. And, the theater was a great place for that. I love this caricature that's titled, During the World's Fair, What One Comes to Look For in Paris. And what you have here are different loges, different offer boxes with different nationalities of women. Of course, it's the French women, the Parisiennes first, and the one on the far right. They are the most seductive. They're looking, as it says, quote, for 2 or 3 devoted hearts to pay for 3 years of bills from the couturier. It's an offer that's valid for the length of the fair. That heart in the center says, mariage temporaire et international. It sort of is a funny acknowledgement, of course, of the temporary nature of some of these relationships. We have British ladies next to them that are only interested in a companion to go shopping at the department store. Then we have Spanish ladies that are looking for aristocratic husbands. And the same thing goes for our American ladies that are in the 4th loge there that you can see there, along with their Native American cousins who are looking for a career on the stage. In the book, I also try to focus on real women as much as possible. And so you can see here a real woman. Her name was Jeanne Duval. She's most famously known as Baudelaire's mistress. They had an on and off again, very torrid affair for more than 20 years. But she also is associated with other men, including Nadar. But you can see here that she's styling herself very much not as a courtesan, not as a cocotte. She's styling herself instead very much like a respectable bourgeois woman. And that, of course, was the power of photography here, that you could really be who you wanted to be in front of the camera. And it didn't need to be quote unquote true, right? So here I've compared it to a fashion plate where you see a very similar gown. And again, of course, a very similar pose. They both have their feet up on little pillows, their hands in their lap with their fans. They're wearing bonnets with the very proper veil to cover the back of their neck. So very much posing in a very serious and not the sort of flirty Cora Pearl style of photography. I also discovered some really fascinating other stories. This is a woman named Sidonie Mertens. She was murdered, in fact, by her lesbian lover with a revolver. She had bought a revolver, but she ended up poisoning her. But then there's this 5-day trial. There were 62 witnesses. There's really a sort of amazing amount of detail that you learn about her life. She apparently had 48 chemises. Her principal lover, a man named Paul Lasserre, takes the stand and testifies to his true love for her. Her murderer, of course, tries to besmirch her reputation and says she had had 48 lovers. There's a whole period when the prosecutor introduces her photo album into evidence and reads off the names of all the men who had given her their photograph. And then there's all these letters to the editor by men who are objecting that, their wives shouldn't see their names in the newspaper in that context. So it really is, you'll have to read the book to get the full story, but it was really a great discovery. And then we, of course, have famous instances of women who aren't courtesans, but maybe who dress like them. So Madame X, famously, it's not her dress that's the problem, it's how she wore it, right? The fallen strap, the very heavily powdered skin, the black brow, and her sort of aloof conviction of her own beauty is what really put off critics. There's other great American stories as well. This is a woman, although she called herself Comtesse Alice de Lancey, there was no Count de Lancey, and in fact, her name was Julia Tall. She was a rich American divorcee, and she was not, I think in the contemporary imagination, a courtesan, but she's often been considered to be one. I think in part, because of this portrait, which her self-presentation is really, is very confident, very sexy, and a little bit threatening, as you can see in the reaction at the time, a Daz model of contemporary elegance. There's a strange and attractive seduction of this pretty woman in a white satin dress stretched out on the sofa, her left hand supporting the most adorable head in the world, and the other holding, like a weapon, a fan. The sparkling look of defiant provocation is below the surface, while the most coquettishly feminine smile accentuates the irritating and charming expression. So I went into more depth with the cocotte, but I'm going to just quickly give you the other types. Please, of course, ask me questions if you have more. But there's always the book. So we have the young, sexy widow. This is the type that's based on originally on the tales of Jean de La Fontaine, which it tells the story of the young widow who on the first day of her mourning is of course very sad, but on the last day of her mourning, like in the Sevens painting, she's like maybe ready to move on. And so we see paintings that sort of take this on, and or even mock the whole genre. I think the Lambron on the far left is really mocking this whole genre of sexy widows, and that painting just cracked me up when I first saw it. But then there's paintings like Claude Monet's The Bench, which is at the Met, that have often been misinterpreted, or it's been hard to interpret. But I really think this is a picture of a woman in half mourning, which is what you see on the woman on the left-hand side of the fashion plate drawing. So maybe not keen to be wooed. It's assumed that young widows are eager to be wooed, but I think in this case, Monet is being a bit empathetic, that maybe she's not quite ready to move on. The third type is the Amazon, the independent equestrienne who had both an aristocratic, but also a rather sexy reputation. Where is she riding off to? Who is she going to meet? Obviously, that painting on the right also made me laugh out loud when I found it. And so I talk about Empress Eugenie as an Amazon, but also about professional horsewomen like Solinka Lesbesky in the book. The fourth type is the savvy shop girl. They, of course, have all the skills to pass themselves off as chic Parisiennes, but wear uniforms while they're at work. They often are famous for lifting their skirts to show off a little leg, as you can see here. And then there's women like the poor Jean Guimet, who, in fact, was French and quite chic, but in the reaction to the painting, she gets labeled American, which I have to say was not a compliment. But it's because that's a very conservative gown, and it's a little matchy-matchy. And she has this sort of stiffness to her that is not in keeping with their expectations for the sort of flirty shop girl. And of course, the final type is the Parisienne. We see, of course, our friend, the portrait of Madame, which is actually the wife of Carolus Durand. But famously, the Parisienne loomed over Paris during the World's Fair of 1900, 45 feet in the air. It became a whole industry to sort of churn out these paintings of fashionable women. And we see both commercial artists like the Stevens on the left, and people like Édouard Manet sort of feeding this trend and interest in the fashionable Parisienne, who wears the latest trends, as you can see here, but also fits the beauty ideals of the time. This caricature also made me laugh out loud. And I'll point out that photo retouching is not new. You can see it on the image on the right. The sort of telltale gray squiggle marks show where things have been edited away to give her an even more extreme silhouette. And then, again, lots of fun details in the book, but this is one of her lingerie bills. She was both an actress and a cocotte, and you can see she spent lavishly. She spent over $6,000 in 1 year on lingerie, including 480 francs on a nightgown, which really got a lot of attention in the press. I also identified a new Parisienne of color in the book that I had fun sort of exploring how she used these sort of stereotypes around the Parisienne, and also played into them, played against them, and played up her exotic side in some cases, but in others very much fitting that image of the Parisienne as you see here. Here is that sort of more commercial presentation of the Parisienne that sold really well. And I just wanted to end right here with these paintings of Berthe Morisot, since she started us off, that they're a little bit surprising, right? Morisot was very respectable, was an Impressionist herself, came from a very conservative elite bourgeois family, but she did these rather sexy paintings for Édouard Manet, displaying her little pink slippers and being rather flirty. And so it was part of her sort of personal style. She wore black dresses and famously wore these little pink slippers. And this is a letter from her husband, notably Édouard Manet's brother, Eugène, saying in a letter, "I've run all over Paris and didn't so much as catch a glimpse of the little pink shoe with the rosette that I know so well." So Morisot and Manet knew this wasn't how a proper bourgeois woman should be dressing or behaving, but they both seem to have taken pleasure in defying those expectations. They had mastered the art of Parisian chic, But just because they knew the rules doesn't mean that they needed to play by them. So thank you very much. Oh, and the book is on sale. It's 30% off, so it's only $27.96 this week.
Oh, thank you so much. That's just so much to cover. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll deliver them to Justine. And I'll start off. I have so many questions after looking at the book. First, what's your favorite style or stereotype of modern Parisian Impressionist women? Do you have a favorite stereotype?
I became fond of all of them, but I mean, the cookette chapter was the most fun because they had such colorful stories and lives, and I thought made a lot of fun discoveries, I would say. It was also a lot of newer material for me, so I was able to discover a lot because of the digitization of French newspapers, which has happened since I wrote my dissertation. So I was able to find some more real stories and like tell more dramatic stories with a lot more detail than I would have been otherwise.
Nice, nice. How did you decide on which images to use? Was it easy to procure them?
It was hard to decide because I had not everything I showed in the presentation is actually in the book because I had 150, but that's actually I have way more than that I had to cut down from. And yeah, I ended up trying to pick the most representative images, the ones that I had the most documentation around. But it was a whole task, as I said at the start. Some of you may have heard. I thankfully did get funding from FIT to help support some of the images. And I did get support from Molly Sean in my department because trying to figure out who holds the image, who has a high quality image, where I can access the image was really a whole involved process that I'm eager not to do again for a little while. It took months and months. And in one case, over a year to get an image.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, you showcase a few photographs in the book as opposed to paintings. You talk a little bit about how that influenced the style of the women, but how did the move to using the camera to capture the subject instead of paints and inks affect the way that women were seen? Did it affect the salon experience?
So I think, we see a lot of paintings sort of in the same format as the photographs would be, these sort of long, full-length depictions. And I think that you see influence back and forth, right? We see of women posing in photographs the way they would for a painter. And so there is this real visual language around how women are painted that develops. But then we also see people who resist it. So, you get the Impressionists famously are not following all of those conventions. And even the Carolus Duran, which you see on the screen right now, it's now called The Lady with the Glove. It looks very conventional to us today, but it was actually a little bit critically, it was contentious at the time because it was a little bit ambiguous, like where she was. She wasn't in like a luxurious sitting room, right? She's in this like weird transitional space. And it's painted a little bit more freely than they were used to. Story that's playing out, which was also a bit unconventional. Like usually you just pose sort of standing there, but here there is this whole like little love story that's playing out. So yeah, it's sort of interesting to see how maybe standards are being set, but then also broken by artists at the time. And the painting was just here. That's why I'm posing at the Met, right? It was here over the summer for the Sargent in Paris exhibition. So that's why I was able to get this shot.
That's amazing.
But it's normally at the Musée d'Orsay, but it was here in New York, which was fun.
That's great. You showed us many adverts. You showed us, the old Harper's Bazaar and the different magazines that the ladies would look at. But there's a part in your book that talks about the salon, and I was wondering if you could elaborate off of the previous question, how did the salon dictate what fashions and what women were shown in the artwork? And like, what were the repercussions of like the hullabaloo of Madame X?
Yeah, so I mean, the reception of these paintings was very complex because it really was the major entertainment. We think about going to the movies or like big concerts, but in the period, the major entertainment for like 3 months was going to the salon to see these paintings, and there'd be thousands of paintings hung frame to frame. So you're really trying to catch attention. And so there's tons of coverage, like hundreds of newspapers would write dozens of articles about the salon. And that's why like text searching has been very helpful, because it enables you to find mentions that you otherwise wouldn't find from just skimming. But there's a lot of attention paid to the clothing. They spent paragraphs describing the clothing. So they're definitely assessing what the women are wearing and how fashionable it is or isn't, and how they're wearing it, and like how they're posed. So there's definitely a lot of women who would go to the salon also to see what is on trend, right? To see the latest fashions. In fact, it becomes this sort of cliche that like dressmakers and like women only are interested in the paintings to sort of see what people are wearing. It's not actually true, I don't think, but it was everyone was interested in what the women were wearing. But it becomes this cliche that only like the dressmakers that's the only thing they care about is the paintings. But also even going to the salon was a big social entertainment. It was free on Sundays. And so there were, I think 100,000 people would go. So like you would go during the week if you could afford to pay to go visit. But it was a place where you could also, show off your clothes. On another one of these sort of public venues.
Nice. I saw a part that really caught my eye in the book where you talk about women somewhat dressing as men.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was quite fascinating. Was there really an acceptance to women dressing as men, or was that a stigma or like a shock, or, what was that? How was that received?
Yeah, let me just go back. So it's the figure of the Amazon. So dressing in tailored clothing is very much, the distinction in this period was that dressmakers made women's wear and that tailors made men's wear, but tailors would make Amazons, which is the French word both for the woman who rides the horse and for the riding habit that she wears. The riding habits were made by male tailors, and they tailoring principles, right? It was thought that men needed to make the habits because they needed to be very precise and scientific, because it's not as obvious here, but the skirts are sort of asymmetrical, so that they cover your legs when you're sitting side saddle, because women rode side saddle in this period. And so we can see, so one side of the skirt is shorter than the other, or is longer than the other, just so that when you're sitting side saddle, you have this even drape. But they wore top hats, right, which is a male hat in this period. And so although the Amazon was very sort of sexy, obviously, in this image, her sort of independence, you don't really know where she's coming from or where she's going to, who she's meeting with. But yeah, the wearing of the top hat, having the crop, which is very similar to a cane, did lead to it being commonly associated, or a very similar image associated with lesbians in the period. And so it was both very fashionable, but also a little bit transgressive, both because it was worn by women who might be courtesans, like Cora Pearl, but also because it was worn by women who might be more interested in women than in men. And so in the book, I talk about a painting by Louise Aveva that I'm sorry I don't have in my slides today, but it shows a famous actress and courtesan of the period, but also famously a lesbian of the period, or bisexual, I guess in this case, coming down the steps of Sarah Bernhardt's house, who of course was also famously bisexual. And it was painted by Louise Bema, who actually is my next book project, that was herself a lesbian. And so a lot of the paintings that she paints are of these women that maybe in a lot of their portraits in like public life might appear in more feminine, stereotypically feminine clothes. In their private lives, they often dressed in a more masculine style, which was not fully accepted at the time by any means.
Right.
But they got a lot of cover because of the sort of riding gear being a very acceptable and fashionable thing to wear. And also because of the entrance of so many male tailors into women's dressmaking, tailored looks in general, even if it wasn't for riding, became much more popular. So we see that sort of fashionability of tailoring and sort of menswear inspired looks spread and become sort of very common, which had to be convenient, of course, for women who wanted to dress that way already.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's just great. I have so many other questions for you, but I just want to reach out to the audience and see if they have any questions. I know Mio, she had a comment, Young Sexy Widows would be a great name for a clothing label. And then she said she had to run, but thank you so much. Gorgeous imagery in this book. I have one last question for you, even though I have others that I would love to learn more about. But how is this book and this research, how have you used it in your teaching and your courses? How is it relevant to your life at FIT?
Oh yeah, it's very relevant. So I teach this honors seminar. I taught it this past spring. It's on fashion and impressionism, and so we of course looked at many of these paintings and many of these types in class. But I talk about this idea of self-fashioning. It's very connected to how we live today. Like that's one of the things I think is so interesting about the period. But that this idea of sort of creating an image, even if it's not completely true, and like giving it out to all of your friends, like they were doing it on paper, but we do it on Instagram, right? And so I talk about that idea of self-fashioning and of sort of creating an image for yourself that may or may not be true, is a very universal aspect of modern life. And it's one of the things that makes these women feel especially modern. And so I'm thinking about writing another course that would be not restricted to honors students, that would be a bit more general. And I probably would title it The Art of Parisian Chic, because I think the idea of Parisian chic is very much still with us, in large part thanks to luxury conglomerates who still push out this image. But I mean, if you think about things, even shows like Emily in Paris, they sort of perpetuate this this sort of idea of this superiority of French style and French women, and we see it in a lot of fashion marketing even today. So I think considering the origins and then the sort of later life of the ideas would be really interesting.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your presentation.
Yes.
The Art of Parisian Chic is wonderful. We have the book in the library, and you can also purchase the book. It's on sale. We really appreciate your time and your presentation. And for more information on FIT authors or how to submit to be featured, go to the website at authors.fitnyc.edu. And thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.
Yes, thank you, everyone.